simple that it's managed to squeeze into a currently uncontested niche. It's not fighting Android or iOS. It's used to provide some smart functionality to $30 phones. You know, sometimes collaborations just work. When their hands. Mozilla, the creators of the Firefox, combined efforts of both Asus. It's used to provide some smart functionality to $30 phones. You know, sometimes collaborations just work. When two companies that are so aligned come together, every now and again, a miracle is born. This ain't that. We're talking about the Garmin phone, the combined efforts of both Asus and Garmin. And it is one of the worst phones ever made. Actually, gonna have a buzzer already. It was basically them trying to make both a smartphone and a sat-nav together. And credit where due, Garmin are one of the leaders in navigation. And the phone did come bundled with a car charger and a mount to install it. The navigation part of this wasn't the problem. The problem was that navigation is just a small subset of what your smartphone can do anyways. Smartphones are like GPS systems, but ones that can also do 1,000 other things too. And so trying to make a smartphone that's based on being a sat-nav is a massive downgrade. I don't think I've ever seen a worse Android home screen experience, with just massive garish icons and no traditional launcher to make your own. The phone's design suffered, with absolutely enormous bezels and no headphone jack. Plus, Google Maps, available on every phone, was improving way faster, and so it was only a matter of time before the one thing this had going for it, navigation, ended up being a disadvantage. So, easy 6 out of 10 fail. This one's like Hall of Fame territory right here. But you can always do worse. Do you remember a company called Doogee? 3 years ago, they had a bit of a one-hit wonder with a phone called the Doogee Mix. It was basically a rip-off of the Xiaomi Mi Mix, but they somehow managed to offer a semi-bezel-less design for closer to $170, which was pretty impressive. But it's just that from this point, they went from questionable to bad to an absolute sham. They did everything they possibly could to capitalize on the success of just this one phone. They released a Doogee Mix 2, which was clearly meant to be a different phone, and then after seeing how well the Mix did, they just relabeled it, because you can tell it doesn't even look like a Mix phone. But then, even funnier than that, in 2018, Doogee held a press event to show us what was coming in the future. And oh dear, they showed off a Doogee Mix 3 with a pop-up camera, a Doogee Mix 4 which is almost completely display on the front and used a slider mechanism to hide the camera. They showed a flexible phone and, get this, a transparent phone. Did a single one of these products actually materialize? No, they didn't. Unless by transparent they meant invisible. The only one thing that we did get was a prototype of the Doogee Mix 4. But when I say prototype, I don't mean a phone that was almost ready to go. I mean a phone with a paper cutout instead of a display. In hindsight, I don't think Doogee had any intention of releasing these products. I think they just thought, we finally have some media coverage, let's just make the most outrageous claims possible to keep it as long as we can. So, I'm giving Doogee a 7 out of 10 fail. They clearly had something with that first mix, but within a year, Doogee very quickly became dodgy. And I would steer clear. Hey, here's a name you haven't heard in a while. Sony Ericsson. This was a collaboration between two companies. Sony, who was largely an entertainment company at this point, and Ericsson, who was one of the bigger phone manufacturers. It was Sony's way of all of a sudden being able to manufacture phones on a large scale, and it was Ericsson's way of gaining access to Sony's Walkman music brand and Cybershot camera brand, as well as just their design. Because, Ericsson's own phones were stylistically challenged, we'll put it that way. And it did work. You probably remember the Sony Ericsson Walkman phones. They sold numbers. But very quickly, you know this, in 2007, the iPhone just flipped the market upside down. And this duo of a company just wasn't agile enough to respond. I think Sony realized at this point that Ericsson was kind of weighing them down with their focus on feature phones as opposed to smartphones. Like, their big attack on the iPhone as a duo ended up being the Sony Ericsson Seisho, a phone that, yes, had an awesome 12-megapixel camera, but literally nothing else going for it. We're talking one of those resistive touchscreens that you kind of need to use a stylus with, and an aging operating system with no apps called Symbian. Within just a few years, Sony Ericsson was making $250 million in loss in a year. So Sony did eventually buy out Ericsson's 50% share to just become Sony Mobile, but the damage was kind of done. By this point, they were way behind. So, Ericsson's own phones were stylistically challenged, we'll put it that way. And it did work. You probably remember the Sony Ericsson Walkman phones. They sold numbers. But very quickly, you know this, in 2007, the iPhone just flipped the market upside down. And this duo of a company just wasn't agile enough to respond. I think Sony realized at this point that Ericsson was kind of weighing them down with their focus on feature phones as opposed to smartphones. Like, their big attack on the iPhone as a duo ended up being the Sony Ericsson Seisho, a phone that, yes, had an awesome 12 megapixel camera, but literally nothing else going for it. We're talking one of those resistive touchscreens that you kind of need to use a stylus with, and an aging operating system with no apps called Symbian. Within just a few years, Sony Ericsson was making $250 million in loss in a year. So Sony did eventually buy out Ericsson's 50% share to just become Sony Mobile, but the damage was kind of done. By this point, they were way behind. So I'm giving Sony Ericsson a prestigious 7 out of 10 fail. It wasn't the end for Sony phones, but it definitely set them off on the wrong trajectory. Okay, now for something that smartphone makers have been doing since the beginning of, well, smartphones. It's deceptive, it's disingenuous, but that also makes it really funny when people find out about it. Faking photos, which I would never do. How many times have you gone onto a phone website, looked at the camera section and thought, wow, you took that on a phone? No, they didn't. I think pretty much every manufacturer has done this at some point, basically just layered a photo taken on a DSLR camera onto their phone screen. And they won't usually specifically say, oh, this was taken on our phone, but they know that's what people are going to think. It's a bit like if I sold you a car online, but then instead of sending you the actual car, I just sent you, well, this. Oh, you thought the photo on the website was the thing I'm sending you? Don't be silly. Thanks for $30,000. But there's even been a lot more explicit cases. Like earlier this year, Huawei was promoting a bunch of photos taken on Huawei phones. But someone watching it noticed that, wait a second, that shot looks a bit familiar. Oh, wait, yeah, it was taken by a professional photographer on a $3,000 DSLR. Huawei is probably the biggest culprit of this. A couple of years ago, they even had a full advert for their Nova 3 phone, where you can clearly see this guy reaching out with the phone to take a selfie. The entire commercial is about how good the camera of the phone is. Not a single photo taken in that commercial was taken on this phone. And it's very obvious. Like, if you're going to cheat, at least do it subtly. Or probably my favorite example is Samsung. Back in 2018, they launched a phone called the Galaxy A8 Star. And they were so proud of this phone's ability to capture photos that they didn't show it. Modesty at its finest. What they actually did was paid this lady $250 for a commercial license to use her photo, taken on a DSLR. But there's more. They then chopped her out of that photo and put her on a different background, also not taken on the phone. And then, to top the entire thing off, to showcase how good their portrait mode was, they pulled open a photo editor, selected this new background that they'd just thrown in behind, and blurred it. And they didn't think to just once put a little disclaimer saying, hey, by the way guys, this photo wasn't taken on this phone, as if it was just obvious. I'm giving this one a 7 out of 10 fail. Kind of made even better by the fact that the girl who was in the photo actually realized what had happened and publicly outed Samsung for it. Okay, it's time for number 1. And just as a heads up, if your favorite fail isn't on this list, that's probably because there's 4 other episodes in this Smartphone Fails series. So do check them out, they're very fun. I'll leave them linked from here. So, in first place is a company called MediaTek. This is huge. So you've probably heard of Qualcomm. They're the #1 supplier of chips for our phones. But they're not the only supplier of chips. In second place is MediaTek, and they've been caught cheating. So it all started when a reviewer noticed that some mid-range phone powered by a MediaTek chipset was performing surprisingly well on benchmarks. They realized that its gaming performance and its app performance was like here, but as soon as you open a benchmark, it was all the way up here. So, was this MediaTek just trying to make their chips seem more powerful than they were? Well, yeah. This reviewer then dug a little further into the firmware of the phone, and he found a piece of code in it that had been distributed by MediaTek, which made these phones running MediaTek chips able to detect that a benchmark was running and dial up their performance to the absolute extreme. Now, MediaTek defended this. They said, well, hey, this is standard practice. Everyone has high performance modes. But the difference is, this wasn't a normal high performance mode that would enable in any demanding application. This was an extreme performance mode that even disabled warnings against high temperatures. This chip was being pushed so hard that it couldn't possibly be sustained for any period of time. So it wasn't representative of the performance you could get in apps. Plus, unlike normal high-performance modes, which would just detect when the load is high and turn on, the code for this extreme performance mode that the reviewer discovered, they called it sports mode. It specifically had the names of the benchmarking apps. So it was built with the purpose of cheating. So then, I thought this was quite clever. The reviewer then tested the phone on an altered version of one of the benchmarks. He changed the code of the benchmark slightly such that the phone wouldn't realize it was a benchmark. And sure enough, straight away, the performance was 30% lower. This is bad. This is as bad as cheating on emissions tests with cars. You've got to remember that MediaTek is so popular that there's a good chance the phone that you're using has a MediaTek chip in it. So, I'm giving this one an 8 out of 10 fail. This isn't to say it happens across all MediaTek chips, and it's not to say you should never buy a phone with a MediaTek chip, but it's definitely yet another reason to take benchmarks with a heavy pinch of salt. Okay, if you enjoyed this video, do consider subscribing. It's been absolutely ages in the works. My name is Aaron, this is Mr. Who's the Boss, and I'll catch you in the next one.
Thank you. Обучение кубизму кубистов. Что такое сейчас? Ух, ну ты сказал. Зачем?